adding and subtracting fractions is a little bit more difficult than multiplying and dividing. To add fractions or to subtract fractions, you have to have a common denominator. If you have a common denominator, in this case the common denominator is 5, you simply add the numerators. And so that is your answer. If you have a common denominator, you subtract numerators, 5 minus 2. And of course you always reduce to lowest terms. If you have a common denominator, this is not too terribly difficult. If you do not have a common denominator, you must find the common denominator. You want to try to find the least common denominator. Some of you told me about using a method called butterfly method to add these together, and that does not give you the least common denominator. So the first thing you want to look at is, does 4 go into 6 evenly? The answer is no. So looking at this denominator, the multiples of 6, 6 times 1, 6 times 2, 6 times 3, 6 times 4. Does 4 go into these? 4 goes into this number, and 4 goes into that number. The least common denominator is going to be 12. My common denominator is going to be 12. So, what am I going to have to multiply this by so that it will be equal to 12? And in order to keep everything equal, 3 over 3 is equal to 1. I am multiplying it by 1. I am not changing the value, I'm just changing the form. 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 4 is the 12 common denominator. What do I have to multiply 6 by so that it will be equal to 12? And you have to multiply the numerator and the denominator both by 2, because that's multiplying by 1. If you multiply by 1, you do not change the value, you just change the way it looks. And so 5 times 2 is 10, 6 times 2 is 12. Now they have a common denominator. You add up the numerators. In Algebra 2, we do not change that to a mixed number. If your denominator 3 goes into 12, that makes it a little bit easier. You don't have to find a common denominator for both of them, just for the second fraction here. And so if I multiply this by 4 over 4, the first fraction minus 4 times 2 is 8, 3 times 4 is 12. And so 5 subtract 8 is negative 3 over 12. And you always reduce to lowest terms. 3 goes into 12 4 times, so that is my reduced answer. Now, when I have expressions instead of numbers, I factor each denominator, and then I'm going to find the common denominator, multiply to make my new fractions, add the numerators, and always simplify. So, looking at example number 5. Step number 1 is factor first. The first thing I'm going to do is factor a 2 out of that denominator. Okay, now it's factored. So now I look to see my common denominator. And so I am going to multiply this so that this denominator will equal that denominator. I need to multiply this by 2, so the denominators will be equal. If I multiply the denominator by 2, I have to multiply the numerator by 2. And so when I multiply those both by 2, this would give me 2 times 2 is 4. 2x minus 1 plus 3 over 2x minus 1. And 4 plus 3 is equal to 7. 2x minus 1. I need to factor this denominator. That denominator factors like this. Now I need to have a common denominator. I need to make my denominators match. And so in order to make my denominators match, I'm going to need to multiply this denominator by an x minus 2. So that each of the denominators will have an x plus 2 and an x minus 2. The order doesn't really matter. X plus 2, x minus 2. The denominators match. And so my denominator in my answer is going to be x plus 2, x minus 2. To get my numerator, I'm going to need to distribute that. That would make a negative 6 plus 3x. And then from this fraction, I have a plus 2. Now in the numerator, I need to add common, add like terms. And so this and this are like terms. They're both whole numbers. And so when I add those together, I'm going to have 3x minus 4 over the common denominator. This will not simplify and reduce anymore. That is your final reduced answer. To subtract, you still factor each denominator. You still find the least common denominator. You multiply to find the new numerators. You subtract. This one's really important. You subtract by distributing the negative, and then you look at your answer, make sure it won't factor and simplify anymore. So nothing will factor there, and so now I need to find a common denominator. To find a common denominator, I'm going to have this one and this one in the denominator. I'm going to need to multiply this one by x plus 5 over x plus 5. I'm going to need to multiply this one by x plus 2 over x plus 2. So that both of them have a denominator with an x plus 2 and an x plus 5. Then I need to find my new numerator. I need to distribute the 1. That's going to get me x plus 5 because I'm just multiplying by 1. Now, don't forget here that this is not a 5. This is a negative 5 that I am going to distribute. I'm going to distribute the negative 5. Subtracting 5 is the same thing as adding a negative 5. So I am going to multiply that together and get minus 5x minus 10. Combine like terms, so when I combine those, the x and the negative 5x, I would have negative 4x, and add these two together, and I would have a negative 5. Nothing will simplify, nothing else will reduce. To subtract, I have to find the common denominator. My common denominator is going to have a 3y squared in it, and it's also going to have an x. It's going to have all of the original denominators here. And so to make this denominator match that denominator, I have to multiply this fraction. This is missing the x term. This is missing the 3y squared. That's going to be 8x squared, and it has this common denominator, 3y squared x. Subtracting 7 would be the same thing as adding a negative 7. So I'm going to multiply negative 7 times 3 for a negative 21y to the third power. Now, we usually, when we write our final answer, write our variables in alphabetical order. We would write xy squared, and so my numerator here would be 8x squared minus 21y to the third power. Adding and subtracting fractions is not easy. You may need to look at this video more than one time in order to understand the examples.